We have our 4 speakers who will be presenting and 15 minutes of questions and answers. And then at the end of the day, we're going to spend some time thinking about sort of next steps and directions and what the early grade reading community of practice needs to be doing in terms of research and more consultative gathering, perhaps, to come up with guidance or tools around benchmarking. First, I'd like to introduce some of the folks here at REACH and the Global Reading Network who helped to organize this. Richard Felty is our program coordinator, but that just doesn't do justice to all the things that he does to help support communications, event organizing, supporting staff, and all in so many ways. So he will be managing all the technology here. So if you're online and you're having issues with audio or seeing anything, please send him a private message to Richard Felty, and he can help you to the extent possible to address those issues. I guess all the other staff are still welcoming the in-person participants, but Lynn Alexander is our communications person, who many of you probably know already, who helps to organize the events. And we have some of our other staff joining us as well. During the day, you're welcome to send a chat if you're online to other people online to discuss what you're hearing, since obviously you're not in the room to maybe have some of the in-person discussions. There's also a Q&A feature that you'll see. If you'd like a question to be posed to the presenters, please send that through the Q&A feature, and we'll be monitoring that throughout the presentations to present your questions, to relay your questions to them, since we are not going to be unmuting anyone online given the large number of people. If you're in the room and you're having any issues hearing, because we don't have the podium mics turned on because it creates a bit of interference with the audio for online participants that is through the ceiling mics, please just feel free to come towards the front or wave your hand, and speakers will try to project a little bit louder. Okay, so I think that deals with most of our housekeeping issues. We will be taking a break partway through, so people can check the World Cup match scores. Not that anybody's going to be looking online at the World Cup matches at the same time as this engaging event. We wanted to make sure that we checked in on the other important things going on globally besides benchmarking. Okay, so without further ado, let's dive into our day's activities. We thought we'd start off with some experience sharing, since a lot of people, pretty much everyone I think, has engaged with benchmarking in some way, or you wouldn't be here. So both online and in the room, we'd like to take just a few minutes, I think 5 minutes now, given we started a bit late, to share some experiences developing and using benchmarks. In the agenda, and then on the slide that we'll bring up, we have some discussion questions that we would like you to consider. So this is we're hoping to provide all of you with an opportunity to share your experiences and using early grade reading benchmarks, and to identify some needs. So I think I mentioned this already. I do want to make it clear that we're not here today to come up with or to say we have the one way, the only way of identifying and using early grade reading benchmarks. We know that there are a lot of different reasons benchmarks are being developed, and there's different methods that are being tried, and there's a lot of exploration going on in terms of what's working, what might not be working, and we're all still coming to that sort of conclusion. So we hope that after this event that maybe leads us to thinking more about what do we need to do more of, what do we need to talk about further with respect to benchmarking. I also just want to note, since we tend to get lots of questions on this, that all the presentations will soon be available on the GRN website after the event, along with the recording. Okay, so back to the experience sharing. Here in the room and through the chat feature online, if you'd like to just take 5 minutes to share what your experiences are developing early grade reading benchmarks. You don't necessarily have to talk about all these questions, but if something resonates with you, for what purpose did you develop benchmarks? How and with whom were they identified, and how were they applied? And what worked well in quotation marks and what did not? And what worked well can be based on sort of whatever metrics or indicators you feel you were, the purpose of the benchmarks. And then importantly, what questions and needs do you still have with respect to benchmarks? I mean, I assume everyone came here maybe with something they'd like to learn about or a question that they have about benchmarking. So we'd like to hear what those are. We'll take some time to share back both online and in the room briefly, a couple of key points. If you don't have an opportunity to share those, please at least send them to us. You know, you can write them down or send them on the chat when we gathering so that we have those as we move forward on this topic. Full of lots of experiences and people talking about needs that they have. So we'll go ahead and get started sharing some of those before we jump into our first presentation. Would somebody at this table or several people at this table like to share what they discussed around their experience with developing benchmarks?
Building resilience.
We got to know each other first, very important. And we discussed the need for benchmarks to be language specific and discussed the difficulty of making benchmarks because of the politics involved in language and the politics involved in expectations and politics involved in working with a government to design these. We just discussed. Anyone else want to chime in?
Move over to this table. And if you'd like to introduce yourself too, I forgot to mention that, just so we know who's speaking.
Okay, I'll start in mine because this is a summary of what all of us contributed. I'm Karen Teach and I'm with Creative Associates, and so hi to people I know. We would second that there should be benchmarks by language and by region. You know, there's not one size that fits all. We felt that there should be longitudinal benchmarks, meaning all the way grade 1 through 8 or grade 1 through 9, whatever the relevant cycles are. We feel that there should be benchmarks for the different reading skills, not just oral reading fluency. We mentioned that we should not forget, nor should others in the field forget, that benchmarks and their measurement are to be used for formative instructional purposes, not for being a successful country or a successful program. And what's happened is that they've moved into kind of a high stakes paradigm that we didn't think was quite right. We also felt that in response to our concern about the longevity of EGR, perhaps countries would not keep it up, you know, so they wouldn't be using those benchmarks. The thought was that one could do some predictive modeling to link it to a more standardized, entrenched task like SACMET. Corey mentioned that. And then, you know, we know that SACMET is going to keep going probably, whereas we're not sure necessarily that the EGR testing will. And so that might keep benchmarks relevant. And I don't know if I left anything out.
That's a very comprehensive summary. Richard, would you like to share any of the online experiences? We had so many, so we'll try to take a few of those.
I would. Emily shared that Emily Mixick shared that sustainability of assessment systems to track progress toward benchmarks is an area we need to explore beyond the technical question of how we choose and apply the metrics. I also have a message from Marion Swift that we are planning special workshops with local partners, ministries of education, to jointly develop the benchmarks and then train all concerned on how to use them, including the Office of Curriculum Development in the ministry, teachers, school directors, and educational inspectors, or education inspectors rather.
Any others you'd like to share?
Nope.
Just maybe a quick summary of a few. I know several people online mentioned the challenges in identifying benchmarks when there's not an nice normal distribution of student performance, and you have a lot of children who are scoring very poorly on the reading tasks. Quite a few people mentioned that. There was also the issue of government acceptance of benchmarks. On the flip side of that, several people mentioned that they are working closely with government and that government has sort of officially adopted or endorsed these benchmarks. So clearly there's kind of a huge range of experiences, I think, across countries and where programs are, where countries are, and governments. So I think we can all be learning from each other in these different contexts as we move throughout the day. So thanks for sharing that and giving us all a bit more background information on what experiences people are bringing to. I know our presenters have also, ones online, have been looking at these and already mentioned that they're going to hopefully be addressing some of these as we go through the rest of today's event. So without further ado, I'd like to invite Heather Simpson to come up. Heather Simpson is the Chief Program Officer of Room to Read. She is responsible for the design, execution, and monitoring of Room to Read's literacy and girls' education programs in 10 countries across Asia and Africa. Heather leads the development and implementation of Room to Read's overall education program strategy, and she oversees the global programs teams. She serves as a critical member of the senior management team, helping to set strategic direction for Room to Read's programs and growth. And Heather is going to be introducing work on setting oral reading fluency benchmarks. So welcome, Heather.
Thank you so much. Thank you. So Room to Read is working in 14 countries right now. We have been measuring reading outcomes, both fluency as well as comprehension and other skills as well. We realized that every language is different, and we wanted to have a more nuanced way to figure out if children are moving along and progressing in their learning skills, and to have a more nuanced way to engage with our teachers as well as schools and communities and ministries that we're working with. That isn't just taking a sort of global benchmark across all languages, across all countries, which is what we've been doing in the past. So Room to Read, we began implementing reading instruction intervention in 2008. We had been doing libraries before that, but we knew that we needed to help teachers improve their classroom practices. In 2011, we started really measuring learning outcome data and drawing on EGR essentially to measure some of our reading outcomes. In 2015, we were able to secure some funding from Pearson to really dive into the data that we have been collecting and we still maintain to start learning a little bit more and becoming more nuanced in this area. And we secured the grant with Pearson, and we wanted to, again, make sure that our targets are being set appropriately. We were a little uncomfortable with the benchmark that we had been using, the global benchmark, sort of the default. So with Pearson support, we've been partnering with RTI to ask some questions. And again, to use this chance to dive into our data and not necessarily come up with the one answer, but to come up with some considerations that we should take into account, and we want to share that with the community so that others can take these considerations into account and perhaps help inform your own practices as well, rather than us saying that we came up with a silver bullet, which we haven't, but some considerations to share. So we wanted to see what the degree fluency benchmarks were useful for comprehension and how that fluency rate and comprehension sort of interplayed. And at what stage in reading development was this fluency comprehension association coming into bear. And we wanted to consider different methods to establish and estimate benchmarks, and Matthew will go into more detail as well. We also wanted to understand what factors determine the level and precision of the benchmarking estimate. And does the recommended approach or different approaches differ by language? Therefore, there could be different ways to come up with benchmarking. And what language characteristics affect this fluency rate and fluency comprehension relationships? Different constructs of languages come into play. And how do the properties of assessment instruments influence this work? We wanted to consider that. And what data collection and data analysis approaches best facilitated benchmark estimates? All things we wanted to consider. And with that, I'm going to shift over to Matthew, who's going to get into more detail. And after Matthew, I'll just come back with some questions and next steps that we want to continue sort of chewing on.
Matthew is a fellow and senior education evaluation specialist at RTI International. He has 2 decades of academic and professional experience in evaluating education projects, particularly in early grade literacy interventions and the promotion of learning through better health. Matthew's research addresses culturally relevant approaches to assessment of social and emotional competencies in Tanzania, frameworks that improve evidence-based decision-making, and methods to set reading proficiency benchmarks. He currently contributes technical work to projects in Malawi and Tanzania that are aimed at improving the quality of pre-primary and primary education in those countries. Prior to joining RTI, he was at Room to Read and was an associate professor of international education at the Harvard Graduate School of Education. Matthew, I think we're ready to go now. Welcome.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Fantastic. Yeah, thank you for the opportunity to present, and Heather, thank you so much for the introduction. Heather outlined a lot of issues that we covered, and we'll be sharing a full report, but I'm going to focus on one particular issue in the short time that we have, which is asking if we can or devise a standardized approach to data-driven oral reading fluency benchmarks. We're open to the possibility the answer is possibly no, but thank you for trying. But we wanted to at least see how far we could go. And just to be clear, we're talking here about a common approach to setting benchmarks involves using data, but also involving deliberation and thinking about what's realistic and having a debate about it. This was really saying, can we extract from the data a clearer idea of where we think an oral reading fluency benchmark should be? This is work with colleagues Chris Comiskey and Marissa Gargano, who are both statisticians at RTI. And I should say that the idea and really the beginning of this work was when I was in charge of data and monitoring at Room to Read. And so that's a way of saying that I'd like you to think of this presentation as an honest attempt by 3 researchers to grapple with a complex issue, because I know that RTI is associated with certain approaches to benchmarking and to assessing reading, and so I wouldn't want this to be seen as a corporate announcement on behalf of my colleagues. Okay, so I'm going to start with the purpose of benchmarking. There are many purposes. I'm thinking particularly for one national education system. If you set a benchmark, it can help them define what they mean by reading proficiency at different levels. It can help set a goal for a system and for schools and for teachers. And it can help simplify the monitoring. You're monitoring proportions of students reaching a benchmark, because counts are easy to interpret. The number of children reaching a benchmark is easier for non-specialists to understand than, say, a mean fluency. Now, so far, so good. All of these goals are met by what is largely the current approach to national benchmarking, which is giving countries a lot of freedom to interpret the data and to set goals within their own goals and what they think is feasible. An additional function of the monitoring counts of children reaching benchmarks is that we can compare or compile data across projects and countries. Now, this is something that Room to Read wanted to do when I was working with them. They have several projects trying to compare and understand how different countries are performing. It applies to the USAID All Children Reading or SDG 4.1.1. So we wanted to know if there's a method we can use that would help us with this international comparability. And at the moment, the fact that we use inconsistent methods, we typically use different methods to set benchmarks that are very country specific, doesn't really give us a comparable or a meaningful benchmark. And similarly, as Heather was saying, the approach of setting a common benchmark, I think many people have pointed out, doesn't apply across different languages that are learned at different rates. So what we want to move to, or what the aim of this work was, to try and produce a consistent method of setting benchmarks with a couple of goals. We think that in order to be comparable, the benchmark really have to have the same meaning in terms of a child's development across contexts. And secondly, it would need to be reliable, so that if you set the benchmark year after year or with a different sample, you would come out with roughly the same value. So those are some of the key questions we had. I'm going to start, before we get into the stats, with a definition of reading proficiency. So if we define reading proficiency as reading with fluency and comprehension, I just want to point out something that I think is often confused in this work. One component of reading proficiency is fluency, and we measure that typically in correct words per minute. Another is comprehension, and we measure this in various ways, but typically in benchmarking exercises, we use also words per minute as a proxy is a strong word because the relationship maybe isn't that strong, but certainly as an indicator of when children are about the right level that they comprehend. So both of these concepts are measured by fluency rates, but they should be considered separately. And you could imagine children in proficient readers in upper grades, for example, you might want them to be reading at 70 or 80 words per minute to be considered a proficient reader, even though the fluency level associated with reading is lower, maybe 40 words per minute. So just illustrating that those two things are separable. So I want to get into the approaches that we used to try and set a comparable benchmark across countries. And there are different ways to do this. We can hopefully get back to this in discussion about alternative methods, but one method is to look at the fluency that's associated with 80% comprehension. So I'm going to show a few of these graphs, so it's just worth getting your head around them for a second. The x-axis here is oral reading fluency in correct words per minute, and then typically in the EGR assessment you have a comprehension score out of 5. And these dots are all individual children, and you can see there's roughly a fit that comprehension increases with fluency. And so picking 80% comprehension as the reference point, this curve would estimate that children reach that around the level of sort of 35 words per minute. So that's the basic idea. This presentation is all about identifying that point in the curve in a consistent way. The way we've typically done this is the mean or median method. So we take a group of students who are all achieving 80% comprehension or above, and then we look at the median or the mean of those dots, the median mean oral reading fluency, and we use that as a guide for our benchmark. There are a couple of reasons why that wasn't appropriate for being consistent across languages and across countries in the way that we wanted to be. One issue is that you have a high influence of high-performing children. So if you could imagine adding more and more high-performing children to this task, to this sample, adding higher grades, the benchmark's going to keep going up and up and up, but that doesn't really signify that that children need to be reading at a high level in order to comprehend. The other issue is this benchmarking method doesn't at least systematically take into consideration the fact that there may not be a good relationship between fluency and comprehension in the language or in the sample that you're looking at. So these dots are an example of children who are reading relatively fluently but with low comprehension. But it doesn't matter how many of these children you get who are not fitting the curve, it doesn't really affect your benchmarking process, and we think it should. So instead of just taking a mean, we wanted to apply statistical modeling of the relationship between fluency and comprehension, which we think will be less influenced by outliers. It has the big advantage of being able to estimate the precision of the benchmark, which is actually related to how well fluency and comprehension are related. If they're not well related, you won't get a precise benchmark. And it's important to know if your benchmark is precise before you go ahead and have confidence in it. And it also comes up with a precise, or at least a fixed range, and there's less sort of interpretation of, well, I'll take the upper end of that or the lower end of that. Three of the advantages. You can, in theory, use any statistical modeling approach that works. We found that the most sort of reliable and also interpretable was to use a logistic regression. The logistic regression basically estimates the probability that you can read with comprehension. So the y-axis on these graphs is now changed. It's now the probability that you can read with 80% comprehension. And it varies from 0 to 1. And the dots are fitted from data, and the lines either side are 95% confidence intervals. We took 50% or the 0.5 probability as the defining point to set our benchmarks. It's a little bit arbitrary, but it actually turns out to work at that level to work best across data sets, but there's no reason why you couldn't have a higher or lower value. And you see from this graph that if you set the benchmark at the level where children have a 0.5 probability of reading with comprehension, the estimate is 33.6 correct words per minute, with an upper bound of 41 and a lower bound of 28. So this is actual data from grade 2 and Nepal students. So we did this with lots of different data sets. You can see here with an example from Cambodia in grade 4 that the confidence intervals are wider, the slope is narrower, and so you see we have a wider bound from upper to lower possible benchmarks. So this estimate that you can see here, 55.5, or this method of producing the estimate is what is going to inform or what I'm going to be showing on the rest of the graphs and data in this presentation. So the hypothesis that we were interested in testing was whether the fluency level at which students read with comprehension is relatively consistent across samples and within a language. So high performing, low performing samples, rural, urban. I think people take a little while to get their head around this concept, so I might just spend a little time on it. But what we're not saying clearly is that the performance level of students may be constant. We might expect rural students to perform poorly and urban students to perform better. But the hypothesis is not that they perform at a similar level, but that the point of fluency at which these children begin to comprehend is the same across different samples. And that we think this is a meaningful point in reading development. This is something that has meaning and something that's worth estimating and may have the same meaning across different languages and samples. So that's the hypothesis we're testing. A little bit of a diversion into what gave us the most precise benchmark estimates, because it has implications for how you interpret the data later. And I think it's also just important to know for good practice. I don't think it would surprise anyone to say that good comprehension question reliability leads to better estimates. But I think showing this empirically hopefully will help focus people's minds on spending a bit of time to get comprehension questions more reliable. This graph, actually the y-axis is the confidence interval of the benchmark estimates in our sample. So the bigger the interval, the less precise it is. And the dots are individual data sets. So we have 72 different data sets from 11 languages, I think. And you can see that the Cronbach alpha only gets to be 0.7 when, the confidence intervals are small when the Cronbach alpha is above 0.7, the acceptable level of reliability. And some of the big confidence intervals, the less precise estimates, are when the reading comprehension tool was not that reliable. And the second thing, which also won't be surprising, but again, good to demonstrate, is that the bigger the sample size, the more precise the benchmark estimate. So again, we have the confidence interval on the y-axis, and you'll see that the big confidence intervals are for samples of less than 150, and we get really quite narrow confidence intervals when we get into very large sample sizes. The Nepal study had 2,000 plus students. So our benchmark precision is better when we have a sample size at least 150. We recommend going higher than that, but that seems to be what our data show. And when you have reliable comprehension questions. I should add that one thing that we don't really have time to present, but is in the report, is that we tested a different method of assessing comprehension, not through the EGR typical 5-question approach, but through a sentence choice test, which I'm happy to tell you more about, and we can certainly read about it in the report, but we found that was a more reliable test of comprehension. So a more critical question for our hypothesis was, if you remember, the hypothesis was that the benchmark would be pretty much the same whatever sample you took. The one factor we found that did affect the benchmark was the overall ability of the sample. So we have a different y-axis here now, which is the absolute level of the benchmark. So the benchmarks range from sort of 20 words per minute to 80 words per minute. And you can see there's roughly a negative trend there, but particularly when, so the x-axis is the proportion of your sample that read with 80% comprehension. So there's dots to the right, we're getting very low benchmarks with samples where almost all the children can read. And this plays out in a grade by grade. So here's a couple of different countries that shows the benchmarks that we set for 3 different grades. And you'll see that for each higher grade, we get a slightly lower benchmark. This is counterintuitive, and if you haven't thought about this before, it may take a little while to think about, but what we think is happening is that as children are more able and as they progress in the grades, they bring a greater variety of skills, or a wider set of skills to understanding text. So, for example, they have better oral language skills. So that means that students at grade 3 or grade 4 who have a wider range of language skills can read at a lower level of comprehension. Sorry, they can read with comprehension at a lower level of fluency. And this graph shows that this pattern is actually repeated across all our data sets, that we, grades 3 and grade 4 have a slightly lower benchmark than in grade 2. Okay, now I want to come to the sort of the big question, which is how do benchmarks set with these methods look across different samples and across different languages? So is it reliable? Do we set the same benchmark each time we do this exercise? Is it so reliable that we can say this is the benchmark for this language? Well, here are the results. And I'm showing the results just for 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 Asian languages, because some of the other languages had produced less reliable results that were hard to interpret. So you see the fluency level is on the y-axis. If we look at different estimates that were taken from the same group of children, but using different EGR passages, we find more or less that the benchmarks are pretty consistent. You can see a couple of exceptions there. The 4th passage in Hindi produced a higher benchmark, and Nepal is definitely an exception in general. So that's just the same students taking different passages. Now, what about different students taken in different benchmarking exercises in different years? Well, we had that in 3 countries. Again, Nepal results are not consistent, but the other 2 countries, plus or minus 5 or 10 words per minute, seem to be pretty similar. And then what about the variation across countries? Well, this definitely supports the commonly held view amongst people who've done this kind of research that it's not appropriate to set a single level for different languages. You can see that the variation is at least from sort of 25, 30 up to 75 in terms of the estimates that are produced here. So we felt there was some moderate success in producing consistent benchmarks with some room for improvement using fluency benchmarks. We also wanted to try out a different approach, which is benchmarking with accuracy. So accuracy is the percentage of words that a student reads correctly out of the total number of words that they attempt. So in theory, they could read only 10 words of a passage, and if they read them all correctly, that's 100% accuracy, whereas fluency is concerned with the rate. And the general theory is that children more or less learn to read accurately before they learn to read fluently. That's the foundation for increased fluency, at least. I won't go through all the comparisons again for all the samples, but in general, you can see that the spread in terms of an accuracy benchmark, so the benchmark tends to be between sort of 85 and 95%. There's much more consistency across languages, and there's consistency within samples as well in terms of the accuracy benchmark. Okay, well, you can, if your eyes have been straining at graphs for the last 10 minutes, I can let them relax, and I'm going to go back to just words now and try and draw a conclusion. Tentatively, we think that the logistic regression method, or a regression method in general, is a viable way of producing consistent, or is at least a viable method for being consistent across languages in the way that benchmarks are set, with some clear room to improvement. Some of the questions we tried to ask, and the first one was, does it lead to consistent fluency benchmarks estimates for a given language? Well, we saw that fluency level, the fluency benchmark level decreases with increasing grade or ability. So, so clearly there's not an argument for setting one benchmark within a language. And a lot of the variability we saw was due to small samples and unreliable comprehension measures. So the question of, could this method with improvements lead to a consistent fluency benchmark estimates for a given language? Well, I think it's definitely worth trying with larger samples, using more reliable tools, such as the sentence choice test that I mentioned earlier. And I think it's important that samples avoid extremes of achievement. So I think when you have a lot of children reading with good comprehension in your sample, it's likely to lead to an unreliable estimate. I also saw comments earlier about what do you do when you, I think from Todd Drummond and others, about what do you do when you have a lot of zero scores. Well, I mean, I don't have a solution in terms of analytics other than following this principle to try and select a sample that avoids that. And I think even if it means going to higher grades, it can be useful. So I think there is potential in this method, and possibly even greater potential if we replace fluency benchmark estimates with reading accuracy benchmark estimates. So the implications, can we develop a method for creating comparable benchmarks across languages, something that we could use in SDG 4.1.1? Well, I think I'll leave that for a discussion, as well as, should this even be a goal? I mean, is this a reasonable goal for the use of fluency benchmarks? And the second question, it's worth noting that even if you think that it's not a valid goal to try and set standard benchmarks across different languages, these results have implications for whether or not the benchmarks that we set within one language are considered reliable. And if that should be a goal of a national benchmarking exercise. Okay, well, I'm going to hand it back to Heather now. I think you'll get these PowerPoints, so please feel free to click on my email address or Twitter and follow up with questions, and we'll be sharing these 2 reports that we wrote, some guidance notes and more detailed research analysis, which are available through the Room to Read website. So thanks, and over to you, Heather.
Thanks, Matthew. I took out, because of time, a discussion about comprehension measures that we've been testing, but just very quickly, we've been testing out paired sentence, which we wanted to do a comprehension method that wasn't tied to the fluency passage in the EGR. So things like we would have a paired sentence and the student needs to choose which sentence is true. So birds lay eggs, dog lay eggs, which one is true? Red is a color, ball is a color, which one is true? And we found that that process has been a lot easier for our teams on the field to contextualize and make accurate, sort of appropriate for local contexts. And it's something we want to continue sort of testing out to see how this works for us. So just very quickly. Some of you participated in discussions that we had maybe a few months ago around fluency benchmarking, and I wanted to raise some of the suggestions and things that we as a community identified as things we want to continue sort of looking at and thinking about, because I think it's helpful to continue sort of going back to some of these things. So what Room to Read is doing as next steps, we're going to continue looking at our data and looking at fluency rates and accuracy rates, and still honing the way that we look at benchmarks across languages, across countries, and even within countries, different languages of instruction within countries. We want to continue to improve and evolve our traditional passage and question our comprehension measures. So again, continuing to hone simple comprehension measures that could be manageable in the field. We also are going to be working with our country offices on language-specific benchmarks so that we're not just defaulting to our sort of standard global benchmark. And we're also developing a more robust research agenda around this so that we can share our findings as we look across our countries. And we want to see how we can collaborate with the broader community on that. And working with partners in countries as we continue honing this. As part of the discussion that we had in November, with our TI and the support from Pearson, some of the things we wanted to continue looking at, further explore this relationship between fluency and comprehension across languages, and looking at language characteristics more deeply to understand what variation exists and what further considerations we need to take into account. And also think a little bit more nuanced around the language characteristics, such as depth and visual form and complexity, and different types of language constructs that also we need to take into account. We also want to look at the relationship between language of instruction, language that children speak at home, language that children speak on the playground, because we know that comprehension is not just about fluency, it's not just about accuracy. There's a whole body around language and oral language understanding, vocabulary, content knowledge that all comes into play with comprehension. So we want to continue to call for longitudinal studies. Peggy mentioned this in our small group discussion, Matthew alluded to it as well, but really understanding as children progress through their learning career, what sort of benchmarks are associated with increased comprehension, even at older grades, that then can help us better understand the younger grades, even in places where we have a lot of 0 scores, but that can help us better understand. And therefore, we want to identify some of those children who in grades 3 or 4 or older have comprehension levels that are allowing them to read to learn, which then can help us understand how to progress the younger kids through that. We're also going to continue administering our EGR and oral language fluency rates. We let children read. We count accuracy rates at 1 minute, and we continue to let children read to 3 minutes. The 3-minute cutoff is for our field team to actually have a manageable way to administer these tests, but that has allowed us to get a little bit more nuanced in our understanding of the progress that children are making. And we want to assess the reliability of level adaptation of the sentence choice tests, and want to also invite others to share their comprehension measures if there are ways we can continue improving that. And Matthew gave the link, but I just wanted to flash up on the screen. We have produced a guidance note. Again, this is the way you need to do it, but these are the considerations that we learned as we were looking at our data across our countries, and things that you can consider. So I do invite you to look at that guidance note and continue talking about it and sharing your own insights as well.
Thank you very much to both Heather and Matthew for those presentations. We're going to take some questions now, both from people in the room and online. I'd like to start with a question from one of our online participants related to the issue of accuracy and fluency. Fernando raises the issue: a potential problem with accuracy is that in transparent languages like Spanish, accuracy is close to 100%. So there's close to no variation in accuracy, but wide variance in comprehension. Perhaps this happens with transparent languages in general. And could you address maybe that issue and how that relates to some of the methods that you were talking about?
Matthew, do you want to weigh in?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, thanks for the question. It's definitely that's definitely an issue to think about. What we found in the data, on all our data sets, that it seemed like there was quite a neat relationship with accuracy, in that accuracy improves from 0 to somewhere around 80 or 90, and then at that point fluency really kicks off and comprehension really kicks in. It's worth saying that most of the languages we were dealing with were transparent. They were certainly more transparent than English. We worked in some very transparent African languages too. And one of the things that we had set out to do was to understand about whether fluency was related to comprehension as strongly in transparent languages compared to shallow orthographies compared to deep orthographies. And we didn't really have enough data and enough languages and enough variation to compare. But what we did conclude was that in all of the transparent languages that we looked at, there was a strong relationship between fluency and comprehension, which is different from what you might predict from the data. And I know I'm veering off your point about accuracy a little bit because we didn't systematically investigate accuracy, but we found that was quite closely related to fluency in general.
Thank you, Matthew. Anyone in the room now that have a question? Sylvia, can you introduce yourself?
Sure. I'm Sylvia Miman Thompson from the University of Oregon. Matt, thank you, Matt and Heather. You said at the beginning one of the purposes was for reading proficiency. So what work have you guys done with either of the comprehension measures to determine what score indicates reading proficiency? So I think that might, you need to know what that is so that then you know what you're trying to get to.
One of the things that we've been looking at is determining children reading or answering 80% of the comprehension questions accurately or correctly.
Right, but how my question is, how does that relate then?
Right.
Concert validity to like another measure of what reading proficiency, right? Like a more generalized, standardized measure of reading proficiency.
Yeah.
Have you done any work in trying to get that kind of concert validity?
Not yet. Matthew, I don't know if you have looked at that, but we haven't yet.
Well, I mean, the only thing that we have is that we've used these two measures, right? So we've used the EGR passage reading comprehension questions, as well as this independent measure, the sentence choice test that that Heather was talking about, and they correlate closely. But we were largely trying to use large-scale data from lots of different studies to combine them. So this didn't involve that careful sort of construct validity, and I think several people are calling for that kind of work longitudinally and cross-sectionally. Sylvia, behind your question, I think, is your idea of what would be a good way to go about this work. So if you want to follow up and tell us what that is, I think that would be great to hear.
I think that you do need longitudinal work, but you also need to identify whether it's, the in-country assessment or, just some other kind of standardized or SACMEC or something that already has reading proficiency defined, that is, there's some consensus around, yes, we agree this is what reading proficiency is, and linking your comprehension measures to that, would be helpful, I think.
And if I may jump in on a related question and comment from a couple online participants, Miriam Bridal Swift asked, are there any other instruments, tools other than EGR that can assess fluency and comprehension, and how do they correlate? You mentioned this other task, that sentence comprehension you mentioned. And someone had asked a question about other standardized national assessment tests that may be used. And you've touched on this here and there, and I'm wondering if either Heather or Matthew, you'd like to say a little bit more, or Sylvia as well.
So Room to Read hasn't been collecting data with a wide variety of measures. I welcome that, as we continue to collaborate. We were really looking at our longitudinal data that we have across all of our countries. So that's what we've been focused on. I know that, for example, in India, there's the ACER approach, and I think there are lots of opportunities for us to look at how these data compare and get a more nuanced understanding as well.
And just to add on that point, I've just been involved in a benchmarking exercise in 5 languages in India, where we did use, where we had data on the ACER tests, which are sort of in a test of, they have benchmarks built into them, as a child able to read aloud a grade 1 level text, and are they able to read a grade 2 level text. It incorporates more than speed, and so those two, that assessment was administered to the same sample of students who had an EGR test, and so we were able to look at the relationship between fluency and comprehension in the EGR and the levels in the ACER, and we find strong relationships, and I could tell you more if I could remember exactly what we found, but we did find strong relationships between them all.
Peggy, I saw you had a hand raised. You want to introduce yourself?
Hi, I'm Peggy Dubeck. I'm with RTI, and I think this is the regression. I think it's a good activity for showing the relationship. A better method for showing the relationship of the rate and the accuracy at which you can understand the text that's given, but I get a little concerned about the guidance notes and how early on in the presentation we're defining to be a proficient reader is to be able to read fluently and to read accurately. And I think this is building a little bit on what Sylvia is saying, is that I'd be concerned if you look at that 4th grade data from Nepal, somebody might think, so now my rate at which I need to understand declines because maybe the demands of the text aren't there, and they have, as described, more linguistic abilities. But I would be concerned that somebody would, and this could be probably addressed in the guidance notes, is saying, oh, that's a proficient reader. But I think anyone that would be listening to somebody reading, part of reading is definitely understanding, but part of reading is also to be able to read at a pace that's engaging, part of children learning to read is to be able to do, to speak publicly with the reading. And so I would just be concerned that somebody would say, oh, if you can read 20 words per minute because you're understanding it, you're a proficient reader. And I would argue vigorously against that, because we want kids to be able to read at a pace that's interesting and sounds fluent. So I would just be concerned on the guidance notes how that, what that means to be proficient reader is described.
Yeah, and we recognize that fluency is more than just counting how fast you can read. It's that expression and being able to anticipate what's coming. We're trying to figure out proxies which are manageable in the field as well, and sort of keeping those in balance is part of our community task as well.
And if I could just add one point to Peggy's, is that we're also talking about grade level passages, right? So when you use the same grade, same level, because we don't know what grade it is, with everybody, yes, you expect it to be different with second and fourth grade, but can that fourth grader then read something that's fourth grade appropriate with the same level of comprehension and fluency, right? And that's, again, to Peggy's point, the reading proficiency part.
Peggy, if I can just respond as well, and thank you for asking the question to demonstrate the point I made at the beginning, which is that I'm not speaking on behalf of all of RTI. In that first slide, I made this point, right, that there's a fluency level associated with comprehension, but that you might want children to be reading more fluently than that. I think at higher grades, I think that the focus on the fluency associated with comprehension is that you can see that as having a common meaning across languages, and it's a good sort of anchor point to set a benchmark that means the same thing across different languages. And I totally agree with what you're saying, but I think that we don't focus on that because it's more challenging to set benchmarks that are similarly meaningful and comparable, that are just about reading fluently and with expression. And that's just the rationale for the approach.
Well, thank you everyone for the great questions and the comments. We have a couple more. There's one or two that I think I'm holding till the end from the online participants that I think will be applicable to some of the other presentations that we can address perhaps at the end. Leslie is ready. Let me just introduce her. Leslie Rosales holds a PhD in Educational Research and Evaluation from Ohio University. She's been a specialist in monitoring, evaluation, and research at Juarez and Associates in Guatemala for over 10 years. She is currently the Principal Reading Assessment and Growth Model Specialist in the USAID Lifelong Learning Project, where she has been implementing the notion of growth in the accountability system of Guatemala since 2014. She herself worked in the Monitoring, Evaluation, and Research Directorate of the Ministry of Education there prior to joining Juarez and Associates. So we welcome Leslie to present some work they've been doing there.
Good morning, everyone. And thank you, Allison, for the introduction. I'm very excited to present this piece of research that takes part of a larger longitudinal study that Juarez and Associates has been conducting in Guatemala since 2015. And so, my colleague and friend Fernando Rubio is in the room with me, so he can help me answer any of the harder questions. Well, without further ado, let me begin the presentation. And I want to start by giving you a little background on how we started exploring benchmarking in the project and in the country as well. In Guatemala, there is a widely spread belief that children should learn to read in first grade. First grade in Guatemala is mostly for children that are 7-year-old on average. However, this complex skill such as reading is, or we all know, is a continuum that goes certainly far beyond first grade and it will not start in such grade and it will not finish in that grade as well. So we started introducing the idea of learning to read as a continuum, and a continuum that implies the concept of growth or progress in the country. This is the reason why we began doing a longitudinal study in 2015. However, this concept of growth in itself is can be understood at least in three ways. One way that the concept of growth can be understood is that growth can mean to know more. For instance, in reading, growth could be that children know more letters of the alphabet, for instance. Growth could also mean that a child performs better as he moves forward in grade levels. For instance, growth could be to read more fluently. But lastly, and in our understanding, most importantly, growth also means to be ready to learn more complex skills. Given that understanding of the concept of progress when learning a complex skill such as reading, we understand benchmarking as to be ready to learn a more complex skill within a continuum. So having said that, we started to look at reading as a trajectory. And I know Allison is going to share one of the policy briefs that we have developed under this idea in the country. But this is one of the graphs that we have been spreading across the country recently. And what you see in the graph is the learning trajectory that students that we are measuring through the longitudinal study, which by the way is set up in the Western Highlands of Guatemala, which is mainly a rural Mayan and bilingual region in the country. This is the trajectory that we been spreading in such setting. And what you see here is that a trajectory implies at least two components. It has a time frame in the trajectory, but it also implies a learning progression. The widely spread, in our opinion, incorrect belief in the country is that children should learn to read only in the first grade stage. And unfortunately, the spread belief is that reading should only in first grade only reaches decoding skills. So what's really been our work is to help people understand that reading goes beyond the decoding skills, goes beyond first grade, and it certainly begins earlier than first grade and begins earlier than decoding skills. So operationally, measuring each of the skills in such trajectory has implied that we use different measurement tools or different tests. Some of the tests that we use are EGR, as you see, but we've also used the national reading assessments that are large-scale national assessments, and that are tests that have been used in the country since 2006, and that are highly reliable, valid, and used every 2 years to report on quality of education nationally. So these are well-received assessments in the country. We've also used the emergent literacy test, which is another measurement tool that has been developed in the country with the help of Juarez in Guatemala, that basically measures all all the prerequisite skills that a children would need before starting to learn to read formally in first grade. And lastly, we have a linguistic profile test that helps us understand the student's oral proficiency before beginning first grade as well, and before beginning learning to read formally. So as you see, in such trajectory and in the longitudinal study, we had a lot of reading assessments that we've been using over time. What I'm going to focus today is the link between fluency and comprehension, and how such link helped us develop this idea of benchmarking. This is what we know about fluency. And I took the words per minute subtest from EGR to explain what we know in this matter. What we know is in the sample that we use, children finish first grade by reading on average 31 words per minute in Spanish. By the time they finish second grade, they finish the grade reading 61 words per minute in Spanish. So as you can see, there's a 30-word jump between one grade to the next. We also know, and this comes from the National Reading Assessments of Guatemala, which, by the way, or I wasn't clear to say that National Reading Assessments of Guatemala measure mostly reading comprehension. So from those tests and knowing that the construct they measure is reading comprehension, we know that by the time students finish second grade, they reach, 1 out of 4 students reach the national standard or performance standard of such test by the end of the grade. And as you see in the graph, it varies with cohorts. There are some cohorts that do a little better, and other cohorts, like the one we got in 2017, did a little less than the previous ones. So it varies among cohorts, but no more than 1 out of 5 students are reaching the national standard. So that's what we know about fluency and about reading comprehension separately. So how did we come up with using a regression methodology such as the regression discontinuity approach to finding a fluency benchmark within this continuum of trajectory to learn to read in Spanish? And what we came up with is to define a benchmark as one that would impact or have an effect on the next skill in such trajectory. Operationally in test, we linked or we related the fluency measure from EGR to the National Assessment of Guatemala in Reading, which mainly measures comprehension. You might know that regression discontinuity has been used to measure impact over educational policy outcomes. So said it differently, we are operationally assuming that fluency would impact the reading comprehension standard or measure. In other words, the benchmark becomes the covariate that discontinues the relationship of 2 variables. Also, as you may know, in regression discontinuity methodology, students are about the same around the threshold. So what this means is that the differences around the threshold are due to being above or below the threshold that one finds or establishes. So or to illustrate such concept in a database, I use this 10 case database to show you how I related the two variables into a regression equation. So the first column, you see that is this 11 case illustration database that I used. The second column shows the fluency words per minute as obtained by EGR. The third column is our item response theory score from the second grade test. The fourth and the fifth column is the fluency transformed differently. One is the center fluency score, which is the difference between the cut score and whatever the student obtained as a fluency score in EGR. And the last column would be the classification of the student as to reach or not to reach the benchmark that we were trying out. So when applying, so what we did with this data is that we apply different benchmarks out of just literature review. So our first tryout that we did was the benchmark that was found in Mexico for the same grade and in Spanish, in a Spanish-speaking population. And that benchmark was around 70 and 80 words per minute. So we started trying out between 70 and 80 words per minute, which number would be significant when applying the regression discontinuity equation. And what we found is that when we reach 80 words per minute, we got a significant, we achieved significancy in the regression discontinuity methodology, which is what I tried to show in this slide. So as you see, once you reach 80, the relationship between fluency and reading comprehension changes. So making sense of this cut score, what we've learned is that fluency, and this is not big news, but fluency understood as words per minute, it's an important predictor in comprehension in Spanish. But I guess what is important is that if we put it in a trajectory to learn to read, fluency, as understood as words per minute, and by defining a benchmark of 80 words per minute, will have an effect in the reading comprehension test. So within such trajectory, fluency becomes a predictor, but also can become a number that can be defined as a benchmark to affect reading comprehension. And we've also came to understand that if that even though students are gaining a 30 word per minute from one grade to another by going from 31 words per minute in first grade to 61 words per minute in second grade, even though that's a big jump between one grade to the next in the trajectory, it might not be enough to reach what the Ministry of Education understands as a performance standard in second grade, because 61 words per minute might be short in fluency for them to reach the reading comprehension performance standard expected by the Ministry of Education in second grade. So although the 80 word per minute benchmark that we found with the regression discontinuity approach was somehow similar to what was found and established in Mexico for fluency in Spanish, and that certainly is an advantage of using the method, because it reached consistency at least with one other country measuring reading fluency in Spanish. There's also the advantage that you can relate a known predictor variable to an educational outcome of interest. In our case, the reading comprehension of the national assessments of Guatemala. Another advantage that might be considered an advantage or not by some of you, but it could be an advantage that there's no need for judges, because you can do this relation without a judgment methodology. But of course, using regression can lead to wrong classifications. And that's the reason why we think that the further research that we have to do from now on is to try to find, as Matthew was saying also in his presentation, the benchmark consistency. And this benchmark consistency that we have found through the regression discontinuity methodology, we can find it either consistency over the years, or we can find the consistency between the languages in the country, that is Spanish and Mayan-speaking students, or we can find the consistency with other Spanish-speaking countries, and lastly, find the consistency with other methods. We know that this research could have some policy implications. So we've first of all known that we need national longitudinal data to establish a benchmark using this methodology in the country. As I told you, right now we're using projects data, and projects data is focused only in the Western Highlands of Guatemala. So we would need a national longitudinal data to recommend such code scores in the country. We've started doing this, but I think we need to do more of spreading of the notion of growth. But like I said at the beginning, growth understood as to be ready to learn new things within a continuum to acquire complex abilities such as reading. And in the context of this research, which was a bilingual setting, it was important to spread the finding that second grade in that trajectory was a crucial grade level. So as I was saying at the beginning of the presentation, it is widely spread in Guatemala that kids would only learn to read in first grade. And people think less of what or how to continue to develop the skill in second, third, and beyond. And particularly in the bilingual settings of Guatemala, second grade became the crucial grade to develop the fluency skill to be able to reach performance standards that are nationally established regardless of the language a student is taught in first grade. So those are the policy implications that we had to consider when we started thinking about this benchmarking idea in the country. So that's it for me, and I'm open to questions.
Thank you, Leslie, very much for the presentation. I'd like to take some questions for the next 5 minutes or so. Does anybody in the room have a question?
Thank you.
One is not queued up. I'd like to ask if any of the online participants also had some questions here. Take one actually then from Matthew had a question around understanding the logic of regression discontinuity approach. He says, your assumption is that fluency and comprehension are related until children reach a certain level. In other words, reach a benchmark. And after that point, the relationship changes. For example, once you can comprehend, reading more fluently doesn't necessarily improve comprehension. Does that sound right?
Yes, it does sound right. Obviously, fluency is not the only predictor of reading comprehension, and even more so in a bilingual setting like the one we were studying. But it is certainly a great predictor of it. And if you're trying to inform stakeholders and teachers as well on what would be the goal to reach with a student in 2nd grade that already know the decoding skills because it was the goal in 1st grade, it's very straightforward to tell them that you need to reach an 80 word per minute comprehension fluency score in the grade, and then the discussion will be, how do you get to that point in 2nd grade in bilingual settings? Am I answering your question, Matthew?
Well, I'm just trying to understand the logic for the rest of regression discontinuity. That's all I'm trying to do, and I think I'm just basically trying to restate what you just told me in a way that I understand. But I think that, are you saying that you're looking for the point at which the relationship between fluency and comprehension changes?
Uh-huh.
Okay, and then can you say a little bit more about why you think that? And what's the rationale for looking for that change?
The rationale is it's a classification, well, sort of like the classification effect. But what the rationale is that the benchmark becomes the covariate in the regression discontinuity equation. So once you put in the classification, you want to know if after controlling for the score of words per minute without being a covariate, if the classification becomes the significant predictor. Am I helping you better? So once you control for fluency without being a benchmark, if the benchmark becomes a significant predictor, and that's when the relation, this is what discontinues in the regression discontinuity.
Okay, great, thank you.
Okay.
Another question.
Okay, Hetal has a question.
Yeah, how is the national I see people are asking the same question. How is the national reading assessment administered? Because typically when we do have national assessment, they're pen and paper. So what was that assessment? What did it look like?
Several online people have the same question. So Leslie, you hear that question okay?
Well, let me rephrase the question. You wanted to know how the national assessment was applied? Okay. Well, the national assessment is a paper pencil assessment. It is applied in a standardized manner. We have Spanish and Mayan, but in this particular exercise, I only use the Spanish one. And the second grade is it's a group assessment. So you have one data collector giving instructions and the kids work on the assessment themselves in second grade. The EGR assessment is applied individually, you know, and we use not paper-based EGR. We're using the Tangerine tablet form of applying it. Yeah. Did I answer your question?
Hendel says yes. Any follow-up to that or a new question?
It's a neat question. Hi, Leslie. Have you used the linguistic profile data in any way to fit into your modeling to see if there's differences for the different language groups? Or is that to come?
We have, Sylvia, actually. And what we're trying to do is, because we're right now playing with fluency and reading comprehension, but as I show you in the beginning, we do have the other tests, and we have enough data now to link the preschool test to the first grade, and then the first grade to the second, and the second to the third. However, the linguistic profile data is still very, it's very new in the classification. We haven't made up our minds to do a classification of the linguistic profile that we can use in the model. As you know, in the linguistic profile, we ask teachers to classify their student in a linguistic profile. And such classification among teachers is not reliable enough to make the link. So we're still working on that link. And it's only been one cohort and 2 years of using the linguistic profile. So I think it'll come better soon.
Okay, we'll take one more question from Peggy and then we'll move on to our next presenter.
Thanks, Leslie, for your presentation. Do you have any information about any part of the sample's ability to read in any of the Mayan languages?
We do. The Mayan languages function differently between each other. So there are some Mayan languages in which kids are more proficient in terms of reading than other Mayan languages. That's one thing that we know. Another thing is that in the Mayan languages, there is no performance standard. So all we know is a distribution of ability within the Mayan languages. And having said that, I can tell you that in some regions, students are a little bit more proficient in reading the Mayan languages than in other regions. In terms of fluency in the Mayan languages, it's a lot slower than whatever we have learned fluency to be in Spanish. And it's something about the language and we're beginning to understand, and not about or a little less in instruction or in the measurement that we're doing of it. And would you say anything else? Let me move to Fernando here.
Yeah, good morning, everyone. One of the things that we have come to understand is that there is a cultural aspect of speaking fast or speaking slow. It seems that there is a premium on speaking not so fast, and people may think that somebody is speaking way too fast is not being careful in what she or he says. Even though we don't know if that relates to the fluency scores, we have put some professionals, some colleagues who are bilingual, who can read and write and do everything in both languages, to do the fluency test in Spanish first or Mayan first, and then compare the two fluency scores. And word per minutes in Mayan languages, even among proficient readers, always come slower. So there is something related to the culture and to the particular languages that may be having an impact on that. We don't know it clearly yet, but certainly there is a difference.
Thank you, Leslie, for the presentation and for all the questions from participants. We're going to move on to our last presentation of the day. Hetal, if you'd like to join us. Hetal Tukrao serves as School-to-School International's Director of Evaluation and Research, where she leads a team of 7 senior researchers, psychometricians, and evaluation experts. She has more than 15 years of experience implementing international education programs from the U.S. and abroad, focusing on program evaluation and improvement at the federal and local levels. She has experience working for USAID, DFID, World Bank, IADB, and the African Development Bank, as well as experience supporting the Howard County Public School System here in Maryland. She holds a doctorate in education policy with a special certificate in measurement and statistics from the University of Maryland, College Park. Thank you, Hetal, for joining us.
Thank you, Leslie. And I'm excited to come third in this amazing lineup. I'm not talking about regression, so I can still keep your interest. But I am presenting on some work that I had the good fortune to do with my colleagues at School-to-School International, with Mark Lind, myself, and Fernanda Gandra, and with support from Louise Barry and Beth Odewald. So the premise here is that data are for driving action. So we're setting benchmarks, we're talking about setting benchmarks. We want to do a really good job of setting reasonable benchmarks. We want to make sure we're using the most appropriate methodology, because at the end of the day, these benchmarks are to make a decision. Right? We want to push forward with some sort of decision based on these benchmarks. So benchmarks are one tool to drive towards that action. So in this analysis, we took there's 3 parts to it. We took established benchmarks, so I'm not talking about how we get at the benchmark, but you arrive in country and benchmarks already exist. So now you're implementing them, you're using them, and you're reporting against them. And this is an exercise in 3 different ways to look at the evidence that came out 5 years post having a benchmark and what that meant for decisions that we made along the way. So the premise here again is that if decisions, and again well-founded decisions, are your end game, then benchmarks are a quite useful tool. So to guide our study, we had 3 key questions. And I'll walk you through. So the first 2 questions are really around about consistency and stability. I know both of my colleagues talked a lot about why consistency matters. So here, the idea is basically that consistency and stability of the benchmark matter, because we're not using just test scores of the kids, right? We're using the test score, we're arriving at a classification, and that classification then is used to make a decision. So that stepwise, we look at the consistency of the test scores, but we're not looking at the consistency of our classification. That was kind of the first question. So to determine the extent to which the use of a test is appropriate to make a particular decision, we do have to examine the appropriate evidences of validity and reliability. So both the issues of validity and reliability emphasize how we use the score. So if we're using a raw score to then develop a cut score to classify a student, then the typical measures of validity and reliability that we use are actually insufficient. So we do need to go the extra step to say, if my test scores are reliable, is my classification, what is my classification reliability look like? So that's the point. So this is the reason we engage in those first two questions. So when we're classifying students using a criterion reference test, the consistency of interest is the classification rather than just the test score. So we had at our disposal 6 different data sets, and I'll use different combinations of these to answer both questions, all 3 questions. The first one is looking at the middle 2 rows that are in bold, and these are, sorry, let me orient you to what the data sets are. I have 4 different test forms that were used across 6 different time points. I have 3 different populations, and they are all at the end of, they're all grade 2, but then there are also some at the end of grade 2 and some through the course of the year. Okay, so we'll use different combinations of these 2 questions. So for the first question, I am using these 2 middle rows. They're 2 different test forms, same population of students, same exact time point that they're tested. So same students taking 2 different forms of a test in one sitting. Forms were developed with the same group of experts. They were developed 1 year apart, and they were not equated because we actually did have pretty high consistency in student test scores. Taking those 2 time points, I have 2 language groups within. And for the purposes of focusing on what the process is, I actually will mask the country and the language groups. So instead, if anyone's a Star Wars fan, this is Scarif and Wobani, 2 planets in the galaxy. The students from Scarif, I compare students from Scarif to their 2 different test forms, and I compare students in Wobani, so 2 language groups. And I have a total of 465 students who took both tests. So a couple of definitions just before I start using them. The standard for grade 2 for these students was that they could read simple text with accurate pronunciation, accent, and understanding. The operational definition for what that meant in a data set was 60 correct words per minute. Again, this was predetermined when we came into this project. And compliance level is the proportion of students that meet that benchmark, that can actually read at 60 correct words per minute. So Matthew, I know mentioned when you have normal and not normal scares people. So this is pretty normal, so this is good, right? So these are, at the top is Form 1 for my students in Scarif, and the bottom is Form 2 for the same group of students. So really high correlation in their individual test scores, and also pretty decent distribution. And then I impose on here those benchmarks. And in this particular country, they did have low and high, which was interesting. But for the purpose of this analysis, we just used the lower end of 60. So if you met 60 or not if you exceeded 90 or not, what that misclassification might look like. And then for my students in Wobani, this is a distribution that should scare you, because there's a lot of 0 scores. But everything is, somebody said earlier, benchmarks are political. So they could not allow a lower benchmark for these students, although the data would not suggest a lower benchmark, perhaps. So these students, different language groups, same country, do still have the same exact expectation of 60 correct words per minute. So then using these established benchmarks, this is established benchmark, how consistently are students classified? Again, their individual test scores were pretty highly correlated. We had a 0.93, which is pretty impressive. But then how well does the classification fare? So this is a frequency count. Each dot is a student. And just focus on the dark blue dots, and that's basically misclassification. So those are students who either met the benchmark on one test but didn't on the second, or met it on the second and did not meet it on the first. So same sitting, same students. So you can see that there is some misclassification. And misclassification is actually typical, right? You will get misclassification. We're not going to get it 100% right. But how right do you need to be is the question I want to continue answering. So, a little technical. So classification consistency, and I'm talking about what the coefficient that we ran to look at how consistent are these classifications. It concerns to what extent test takers are consistently reported as having passed or failed. So the statistic is called a kappa coefficient, and it's to determine if two classifications for the same student are in agreement. So you can interpret it as a percentage. So the first row tells you for all of my students across these two language groups, I had a correct classification of 70%. So that, if we use interpretations by Altman, that's pretty good. But on the flip side, you have 30% of students who are actually being misclassified across two test administrations. Then we looked at it by subgroup. So you see there's a couple of subgroups here I'm showing. So there's student gender, school location, the school gender, whether this was a boys only, girls only, mixed gender school, and student. And you can see the ones in red where they're higher, they're actually lower. They're lower than the overall group. So this begs the question of, is misclassification within particular subgroups okay or acceptable? And especially when you get down to students who are over or underage, we're now about, have a 50-50. We're 50% classifying them correctly, 58%. These are two of the more interesting, or equally maybe somewhat more interesting subgroups that we looked at. First is language consistency, and the way we define language consistency was we asked students, gave them a list of language options. Which language do you speak at home most often with your family? What language do you speak at school most often with your teacher and friends? And when those two languages were different, we didn't judge whether it was a language of instruction or not. Whenever those two were not the same selection, we said your language is inconsistent. And so students who said their language was inconsistent actually had a really high rate of misclassification. So here we're 46% of those students tend to be misclassified. And then high SES students were more misclassified than low SES. Not quite sure why. And then we also had subgroups by district. So in SCARF, we do have some geographical subgroups that we looked at it by. And District 5 officials should be very unhappy about this 60 correct words per minute, right? We have a really high rate of misclassification for their students. District 2 and 4 should probably also be in that same group, which I'm happy. And so kind of revisiting what does that benchmark actually could it be, and why is it misclassifying those students at such a high rate? So these benchmarks, again, we've been talking mostly about oral reading fluency and the reading comprehension benchmark. So then I looked at, well, how do the students who were inconsistently classified and those who are consistently classified, how do they differ on the foundational skills? So do they actually also have such a large gap in classification on things like letter sounds and and I'm still kind of trying to make sense of this, so ideas in the room or online about what this might be meaning. There was a very low rate of misclassification in the foundational skills. So students who were misclassified on oral reading fluency and comprehension actually had pretty comparable scores to students who were classified. So in a sense, you're not getting like these borderline students who, once you're on this side and once you're on that side, they're kind of pretty consistent on these skills. I think there's things that this might suggest about the test or even the relationship between some tests. But yeah, still trying to think through that. So at the end of question 1, the question I want to leave you all with is, would this benchmark be appropriate for high stakes decisions? You have a 30% misclassification rate, but it was also not equitably distributed across subgroups. And on top of that, this misclassification data is not part of the benchmarking process currently that we have. So how could this actually change or shift the decisions that we make in the benchmark? All right, so question 2, and I know Matthew looked at this as well, of how stable are the benchmarks. So again, back to having multiple data points, if you were to recompute the benchmark based on the mean or median method, what would you get? How would they differ from the 60 correct words per minute that were established before? So for this particular analysis, we used the 4 groups in bold, and so it's 3 different populations. I have 3 different test forms, but they're all at the end of 2nd grade. So sorry, I have 3 populations, 3 test forms, but 4 total data points. And for the students in SCARF, so this was the better distribution, not the high proportion of 0 scores. These are the ranges that we got. So if we were to say, what is the student who's achieving 80% comprehension, what are their fluency rates like? And these are the ranges that we got from the 4 different data points, from the 4 different data sets. When I impose the 60 to 90 on there, now, if I was to use 60 correct words per minute on that first population, I would have misclassified those students who read between 48 and 60 correct words per minute. Because in that test, they were reading fluently with comprehension. But in my cutoff of 60, they are not. So how do we reconcile those differences? On the whole, though, we're in range, right? We're in decent range, but definitely some questions around what would you do with students who are at the lower end, what we would actually be misclassifying them. For Wobani, this was my not so normal distribution. Some 3 data points kind of come within range as well. 1 is definitely an outlier, so hopefully we would not have used that second row to set any kind of benchmarks.